the time to talk about these. By the way, to give credit to Mr. Hoagland, he put out a book called The Monuments of Mars. Richard Hoagland by North Atlantic Books out of Berkeley, California. Now, I want to just mention that later on, NASA put out some supplemental photographs years later, which the same effects do not appear. And NASA says this was just the lighting of that particular mission shot. So, was it just a lighting problem, or was that really a face on the moon? Well, not too long ago, NASA announced that they had found what appeared to be a rock from Mars, yes, from the planet Mars, that had life on it. A fossil was found. Wow. Some worm-like fossil, they said, from Mars. Shocked the whole world. There is life in outer space. Bacteria, life, and maybe more. That's what they said in this article. Now, I have this from a tabloid. It's very interesting. Dick Morris, who was the top White House advisor, political advisor to President Bill Clinton at the time the Mars rock showing there might be life on Mars was found. And this is very interesting. This is a call girl up here, if you'll see in this picture. And it just so happened that when Clinton talked to his chief political advisor, Mr. Morris, and gave him the news, Mr. Morris was, well, he was having a tete-a-tete with his girlfriend there in the hotel. Sherry Rowlands was her name. And it says that while Clinton was on the phone to Morris telling him about the military secret that only 7 people in the world knew about at the time, the discovery of life on Mars, Morris was there in the hotel room, and he turned to her and said, well, now you're the 8th. She was the 8th person to know a call girl or hooker connected with the Clinton administration. Well, it didn't work out. Scientists started looking it over and saying NASA's all wet. This was all propaganda. New rules of science, says this one article. People said no. Hype on Mars was how this article put it. Hype on Mars. Says it's pure baloney. The fossil was not real, and there was no life found on Mars. But it did stir up a lot of interest. Look at this. From Newsweek. Mission to Mars. We need to go there, the red planet. There could be life. Mission to Mars. Newsweek came out. And then Time, not to be beat, said, is there anybody out there? Big feature article. They say these magazines sold a lot. Then there was, of course, items like this. Questioning coming out. Could there be aliens? Could there be extraterrestrials? After all, if NASA did find life on Mars, could there be life like this? Oh, very interesting. Well, in any case, this book came out even before we supposedly found life on Mars, or didn't find it according to what you find. This is a book called The Birth of the Moon. The Birth of the Moon. And in it, this scientist, Louis Manson, says that the moon actually once was part of Earth. And a great catastrophe or calamity occurred, and a piece of the earth broke off and then was captured by gravity and became our moon, our present moon. And he got some photos from NASA and began to look at them to see if he could find, if that were true, then the great beast and prehistoric creatures that once roamed the earth would be on the moon, would they not? After all, if they were here, and then a big chunk of the earth flew off into space, was hurled into space, was captured by gravity and became our moon, then there might be fossil evidence that these creatures from the planet Earth were up in the moon. Well, look at this. First life discovered on the moon, said Mr. Manson way back in 1966. Now this rock formation, he said, appears to be the petrified head of the Critosaurus. Could it be? Friends, you decide. There it is. Is that indeed the head of the Critosaurus? Take a look and see for yourself. It does look very suspicious. Is that the Critosaurus? This rock formation was found on the moon. And then here we have on the other side from a NASA photograph that Mr. Manson looked at very carefully. He says this looks like a giant squid. This fossil, here is a picture, of course, of the squid on Earth, and there is the fossil evidence, he says. Could it be? Is that, in fact, evidence of life that once existed on the moon? By the way, a lot of people wonder about my interest in this, and I did a whole audio tape investigative report on this cosmic collision, by the way, supposedly, and the birth of the moon, to see if that might be so. I've always been interested in these things. As you know, I'm a former Air Force officer, spent 20 years in the Air Force, and for 5 years I was at the University of Texas teaching all about new weapon systems, including missiles. And one of the subjects that I taught to students there at the University of Texas was the history of airspace, aerospace, and aviation. The history of the Air Force and of aviation and aerospace. So I have a special interest in these kinds of topics. We've talked about everything from witchcraft and Masonic rituals in space to the faces of a beast in the Eagle Nebula. And by the way, that's interesting, isn't it? Some of those shots from the Hubble telescope were photographs of the Eagle Nebula. We get back to the old eagle of Freemasonry, don't we? Now we're going to go to a more serious topic, though, if those weren't serious enough for you. It has to do with astronaut murders. Astronaut murders. Some astronauts have been killed, 3 specifically on one flight, and then you'll remember the Challenger flight. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But one of the Apollo flights, Gus Griffin, Mr. White, and others were killed. And there have been some very, very strange accusations, or maybe they're not strange at all. For example, Gus Grissom, he was one of the top astronauts in the American space program. Gus Grissom's son made this accusation: my astronaut dad, he said, was murdered. Was murdered. My astronaut dad was murdered. Here's a picture of Gus Grissom. Very handsome man, and by the way, they named an air base after him, Grissom Air Force Base, after this tragic death. 3 astronauts in this Apollo craft actually never took off because they were incinerated. They were burned alive. Here's a picture of the spacecraft. NASA still has kept that over the years. Exploded on the launch pad. And these 3 were burned alive, we are told. Although NASA changed its story several times, it seems, exactly as to how they died. But Gus Grissom's son, according to this article, says that he thinks NASA's responsible for their murder. This is from Great Britain, of all places. Focus magazine, one of their top sort of investigative news magazines, looked into space conspiracy, the NASA cover-up that killed 3 astronauts. And an incredible article in here, Apollo 11, NASA's dirtiest secret. Could it be? Here are the 3 astronauts on a dress rehearsal for the flight. And then we go on to these shots inside, and here again we see the same picture, if you will, of the charred remains of the capsule of this Apollo ill-fated non-flight. From the Free Press, Kerrville, Texas, this item says, retired NASA engineer reveals Apollo death's cause was a cover-up. A cover-up. Very interesting, isn't it? Well, then we get